Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Supporting Clinicians in Chaotic Times, a program for protection, recovery, and resilience, sponsored by Apollo MD. I am Mackenzie Bean from Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We look forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Dr. Michael Lipscomb is the Chief Quality and Patient Safety Officer and Regional President at Apollo MD. He is board certified in emergency medicine, and in 2000, he joined Apollo MD at North Fulton Hospital, becoming medical director of the department in 2005. With extensive experience in optimizing emergency department flow, EMR use, and patient satisfaction, Dr. Lipscomb became Chief Quality Officer for Apollo MD in 2016. Dr. Yogan Patel is President of Apollo MD and also a board-certified emergency medicine physician. Dr. Patel joined Apollo MD in 2007 and has driven the success of several large-volume emergency departments by maximizing throughput, enhancing the patient experience, and improving clinical quality using strong performance-based incentives to align providers with health system partners. In addition to his leadership role, Dr. Patel is a practicing emergency physician proudly serving communities throughout the Carolinas. Evan Howell is the Chief Clinical Operations Officer and Chief Advanced Practice Clinician at Apollo MD. Evan works directly with Apollo MD's operations teams and client facilities on all clinically based process initiatives. He serves as an internal consultant, performing service line assessments, departmental throughput analysis, new process design and implementation, physical plant design and redesign, and patient experience initiatives. Evan is a Lean Six Sigma certified and has practiced as a physician assistant since 1999. At this time, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Dr. Lipscomb to begin the presentation.
Hello, and thanks everyone for taking the time today to join us for this important topic of physician burnout and wellness. This is Mike Lipscomb, and I'm going to spend about 12 minutes explaining why we're doing this. Yogan is going to take about 30 minutes to discuss specifically what our team is doing about this, and Evan is going to end in just under 10 minutes about how does this work in action, and specifically actions we've taken during the current COVID crisis. We hope you'll find the next hour valuable. So I'm going to start with why we began Personal Sigma. This is me, Mike Lipscomb, MD. I've been in emergency medicine practice for over 25 years, with the last 20 at a busy Level 2 community trauma center. In addition, I serve as a Chief Quality and Safety Officer for our team. And my colleagues today, Evan, Yogan, and I, as well as all medical providers, we entered medicine for the same reasons. Medicine is a noble profession, make our families proud, but mainly we entered for the purpose of serving patients, anyone coming through our doors. But this commitment was to everyone except for ourselves. You see, early in our training, we learned to give up everything, our time, our energy, even our well-being, and we place ourselves behind our patients. And ironically, this commitment winds up robbing not only ourselves and our families, but also our patients of our ability to provide them exceptional care. And I have personally felt this impact. No, I have not tried to commit suicide. I've never suffered from severe depression. My situation is like most physicians in APCs. It's more insidious, unrecognized. It's unrecognized burnout, no awareness of what's going on. We all know the statistics about a physician, burnout and suicide. We know it's a significant problem. It's not unique to physicians. It's prevalent in all healthcare workers, even you listening today, healthcare executives and hospital leadership. Nationally, we know that physicians have the highest suicide rate of any profession, about 1 a day. That's double the rate of the general population, and it's higher than even military personnel. The ramifications of physician suicide go beyond the physician and the physician's families, directly to the patients that we care for. And the problem becomes worse when we're under crisis. The above pictures are from Wyckoff Medical Center in Brooklyn, the hospital with the first reported COVID death in New York on March 14th of this year. That very same day, I saw my first COVID patient at my hospital in Roswell, Georgia. That patient died 10 days later, the first COVID death at our hospital. The impact hit me days later after his death in his online obituary. He was a teacher and a coach at a local high school. His obituary had hundreds of comments about the profound impact that he had shaping the lives of the next generation of men and women. He came to our hospital for my help, and I failed him. Physicians, APCs, and nurses in New York, they were also regularly presented with extremely ill patients, way beyond the usual numbers. So many deaths that a makeshift morgue was created, which you can see in the bottom right of this picture. The increased stress pushed certain physicians and APCs over the edge. In a highly publicized New York case, an ED physician committed suicide. What was confusing about this is this young female, by all accounts, was very well adjusted. She had no history of mental illness. She was a leader in her emergency department. She was the medical director. And she was very active in the community as well. So we asked the simple question, why would a seemingly normal emergency physician, used to dealing with stress on a regular basis, commit suicide? And how could we prevent it? Physician suicide is but a tip of the iceberg, so to speak. We all know the close relationship of suicide to burnout and stress. We'll talk definitions later, but a key component of burnout is not stress alone, but prolonged, uncontrolled stress with no support. Stress, you see, it's a necessary part of all of our jobs, but we need the time, the tools, and the support to control it to prevent burnout and depression. Statistics are clear. More than half of doctors are burned out, and 88% are moderately or severely stressed. And burnout and stress, we know, lead to a number of untoward effects, familiar to all of us. Lower patient satisfaction, worse patient outcomes, medical errors, higher mortality. So this is me, again, Mike Lipscomb, emergency physician. And this is what I signed up for. But rather than this, I go to work for this. We spend a majority of our time right here. This is our world, and specifically my world on Friday, August 16th, 2019, which happened to be a fairly busy day. This picture, by the way, is not staged. This is an oh my goodness moment where I stepped back and I took a picture of what was going on at the very time I realized that I made a significant medical error. A lot of noise here. In addition to the EMR, there's my iPad complete with emails and texts. I have EKGs getting dropped over my shoulder on my desk. I have my to-do list. It's behind my iPad over there. And the telephone in the back left. It can ring at any moment with a physician or APC sending in a patient. Or it could be a consultant in the hospital checking in on a patient. And I may not take care of myself very well. In fact, on this day, I skipped breakfast and I was drinking the Diet Coke, which you can see over there to the right. So what happened here? In the middle of all this noise, a 9-year-old boy with appendicitis inadvertently received an abdominal CT scan that he did not need. The error was ultimately my fault, as I had ordered the test. But you see, a CT scan, ordering a CT scan in the EMR was the only way I could give the boy oral contrast, just in case he might need a CT scan with oral contrast. It turns out, though, I was able to flag down an adult surgeon to see our child, and when the exam and blood test suggested appendicitis and he confirmed it, we set up the child for transfer to the pediatric hospital, and he didn't need a CT scan at all. And I went ahead and did everything. I spent so much time. I filled out transfer forms. I spoke with the pediatric hospital concerning the CT scan. I talked to the patient's nurse and even the patient's mother saying, hey, your child does not need a CT scan. But I never canceled the scan. And long after I thought this child had left, I thought they were even getting their appendix out, I received a call from our radiologist. Congratulations, you were right. This 9-year-old boy has appendicitis. But not much congratulations for me. He received 300 x-rays he didn't need. One other thing I remember about that day was in the middle of all that craziness, there was a patient who scratched her eye and just needed a quick exam. I could care for the patient in minutes, but he needed the slit lamp, and here it is. So for y'all, those of y'all that don't know what a slit lamp, there's the slit lamp, surrounded by a rolling cart, surrounded by a mobile EMR, and no chairs. So what's playing in my head is that while all this craziness is going on, nobody is here to help me. And I have a patient here tapping his foot, wondering what's taking so long. So this is what I do when I have a moment. We do something like this. You see, there's no plan. This is how our profession deals with stress and bad outcomes, alone. And I only have a few minutes to deal with this in my head as other patients are waiting. And on August 16th, I spent a few minutes collecting myself about the 9-year-old boy who received an unnecessary CT scan. But it could be after the death of a child who drowned, a teenager with a severe head injury from a car accident, and in one of the toughest ones for me, it may be after the death of an elderly patient whose spouse tells me they just lost their best friend. But the patients who thank me, they don't come to mind. I remember my mistake about the 9-year-old boy and the slit lamp, and I didn't reflect on the fact that we actually saw a high number of patients that day. We actually saw 114 patients that day with 1 LWAT and 1 AMA, and the metrics actually looked quite good for such a day. You see, we're wired to remember and focus the negative, And many of our policies in our hospital actually enforce this. I may go to peer review for the 9-year-old boy receiving the CT scan, or I may get a patient complaint as well, which may go on to administration. And what people remember about Mike Lipscomb from August 16, 2019 is the patient complaint, not the metrics, not the things that I did well. So I may go home, and by the way, this is my beautiful wife, Susan, and rather than give her a kiss and see how her day went, I might walk right past her to that couch behind her, and I'd hold up my hand, say, "Don't bother me, I need some time to unwind." And on my way to the couch, I might stop by the liquor cabinet and drink too much of this. Or worse yet, I might have a problem with this. Or change the scenario. Maybe when I walk through the door, I see this. And I take out my frustrations by arguing with my wife about how could she let my daughter's dog, August, tear apart a pillow and cause such a mess. Or maybe I have the personal insight to stop and pause, and rather than get angry, laugh and just share this funny moment for the funny moment it is with my wife. And actually this day I chose the latter, and I was able to pull out my cell phone and take this picture. And why did I make the choice to laugh rather than get mad? To some of you listening, that may be very obvious. Why start an unnecessary argument? But to some of us who are routinely stressed and come home from work frazzled, we don't have the foresight to recognize what's going on. We're not in the moment. The reflexive brain takes over and we choose to argue. And we ruin the rest of our evening, which carries over to our patients tomorrow. So what happened here? About a year prior to this photo, I was fortunate enough to hear another physician talk about a better path and how it helped him. And for some reason, I chose to listen that day. And after 3 days of training with other physicians in various stages of burnout, I started my current path to make my life better, which is help my family, my work colleagues, and my patients. And no, I'm not fully fixed. It's like diet and exercise. It's a continual battle. But I'm aware of what's going on more than I was before, and I have the tools, which is 90% of the solution. And I brought these ideas back to our team. And while we have always been a physician in APC-centered practice, we knew we could do better. And that was the start of Personal Sigma. New England Journal of Medicine in August 2017 discussed physician well-being, and there's 3 components. You can see it circled to the right. The first 2 pieces in red involve the organization. And the first is promoting and displaying a culture of wellness within the organization. Encourage team members. Tell them when they're doing well. Show them that their health and well-being are important. The second is helping physicians and staff with efficiency of practice. Improve the EMR, make the workspace easier, remove roadblocks. The third involves the individual and his personal resilience. And while it requires personal work on the part of the physician or APC, it does involve giving them the tools they need to be self-aware, to be in the moment, and to be a positive and realize the influence they have on those around them. And I have examples of each of these. Example 1, culture of wellness. We may go to work with our hospital partners to do this. And this is our CEO in the red shirt and myself, who 2 years ago, we decided to run in the local annual 5K. And the next year, it became this. Example 2, efficiency of practice. This year, we received voice dictation. So I can get back to this and less of this. 3, personal resilience. As physicians and APCs and nurses, we understood the importance of reminding us of the positive during this horrible time of COVID. And we hung signs on our ED like this and like this. And in a great note from our administrative team emphasizing culture of wellness and helping me with my personal resilience, a note thanking me for patient experience. And this note came out to me after a particularly rough day, much appreciated at the moment. And even our tech Courtney understood the importance of efficiency of practice. He had the SLIT lamp up and running the next day, complete with chair and stools and no clutter the very next day. And I won't try and classify this one, but a few months ago, Susan and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. And in a huge step forward for me, I turned the cell phone off and we thoroughly enjoyed our dinner that night. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Yogan Patel. Yogan serves as our company president. He's also board certified in emergency medicine and works clinically in North Carolina, running our North Carolina office. He's going to discuss specifics of Personal Sigma and how it supports our physicians and APCs.
Thanks, Mike. I know sharing personal truth can be really hard, but every time I hear your story, I'm more proud to be your partner. So thank you for that. And thanks for giving us a really powerful example of what I know a lot of us here have come to believe, that people are our greatest asset. I mean, this is a profound statement, right? 5 words with tremendous meaning. 5 words that remind us of what we're made of. And 5 words we've heard countless times in our careers. 5 words that I desperately wish were true. I can't tell you how many times this statement has been said and repeated, but the real question is how often is it put into action? I mean, let's think about this. How do we value our human capital? For example, every organization I've ever been a part of has always taken a keen interest in the customer, the consumer. I mean, in healthcare, we talk about patient experience. What started as simple mail-in surveys in the 80s and 90s, then progressed to phone interviews and score reports, verbatims. Then we had a decade of advanced patient experience analytics. I mean, I've even seen hospitals printing baseball cards with the physician picture on the front and the stats on the back. We now capture patient experience at the very first point of human contact in our hospitals. Actually, in fact, with smartphones, we're even able to catch and engage with patients before they come to the hospital. I mean, we track every interaction the patient has, and here some would say consumer, in our ecosystems. An entire new science has been created around shaping and optimizing this patient experience. This is a good example of a consumer journey map. And from retail to healthcare, this is an entire industry. I read this note recently by Diana Dosick, a partner at the Boston Consulting Group, that companies spend over $1 trillion to understand consumer behavior, from mapping out consumer journeys to creating personas to developing content for target demographics. I mean, companies say this is the foundation on which they're built upon. But the reality is that companies spend 1,000 times less understanding and shaping the journeys of the people they depend on most. And in healthcare, we know from experience that it's far easier to study the needs of our patients than it is to understand the needs of the people that care for those patients. I mean, think about it. We have Press Ganey surveys, HealthStream, Studer, real-time feedback tools. We've got whiteboards in our departments. But when was the last time your organization measured the needs of your clinical teams? I mean, most organizations have a chief marketing officer long before they have a chief wellness officer. How many of you perform an annual physician survey or an employee trust survey? Now, I clearly can't see your hands, but I imagine a lot of them are raised, and that's terrific. But the question is, what do we do with those results? Are they put into action? Are you a leader who's sitting down with your clinical teams? Have you broken bread, listened to their experiences, their frustrations, their motivation for choosing medicine and for choosing to serve in your community? And if so, have you taken that dialogue, channeled it into improving your culture, and created a better environment for the people that depend on you for support? Essentially, before doing a trust survey, have you done the work to create trust? Now, I'm not here to tell you that you have to spend millions on this concept. I'm really just here to point out the obvious, that all of the Press Ganey surveys and Studer coaching in the world won't help you save a failing clinician. Now, do you think failing clinicians impact your patients? This little guy here is a magnolia warbler. You see, birds like this one are what scientists call an indicator species. They serve an important function as leading indicators of environmental health. There was a study late last year in the journal Science, I think it was October, that reported nearly 3 billion North American birds have disappeared since 1970. Now that's 29% of all birds on the continent. That's actual loss of familiar species. We're talking about ordinary backyard birds like sparrows and swallows and swifts and blue jays gone. Start to consider your clinicians and healthcare teams as indicator species. They are the canaries in the coal mines of healthcare. So, how do we save them? Fortunately, I'm here to tell you that it's not too late, that with an investment of time, of listening, of solid communication, and thoughtful action, with your skills as successful leaders, we can save clinicians, we can save healthcare teams, and we will save patients. This is definitely one of those help me, help you, help them scenarios. Now, as an independent group serving hospitals over 35 years, we've learned that support of our clinical teams is critical to long-term success. Like a lot of you, we've lost far too many colleagues to count. And every year we witness a continual erosion of clinician satisfaction, of physician autonomy, of personal fulfillment. And this has accelerated symptoms of burnout and led to a lack of engagement. This is what we call moral injury. When you're unable to give patients your best, it's a failure of the system that fails the clinician that may ultimately impact patients. And as we've grown over the years as a partner for dozens of institutions, we've made this our mission. We simply believe that healthy clinicians lead to healthy patients. And if you're trusting us with serving your community, we need to be the people who take care of your people. And in order to do that, we needed to invest more deeply in our ability to care for our teams. That realization led us to the Personal Sigma Initiative. Now, Personal Sigma is an intentionally designed program to support our people reaching their maximum potential. It's rooted in our own experience, in listening to our people. And the first step wasn't easy. I mean, honestly, it was difficult and led to several uncomfortable conversations. I mean, we were analyzing pain points that we didn't even know we had. But ultimately, that led us to understanding which program elements would be most useful. We filtered those conversations, we scoured the latest evidence on human performance engineering, and we developed a program that's really more of an evolving support system. We focused our efforts along 6 primary areas that align with the critical needs we saw across our entire spectrum of clinicians. I'm going to briefly explore these with you, explain why they're important to us, and lay out a brief case as to why I think they should be important to you too. As we talk about these, I'm going to highlight some concrete steps that I'll challenge you to take back to your respective institutions. And before we get into the program, I'll share the first one. By the way, this is Dahlia, one of our environmental services workers in our ED. And she's talking about her experience working in our ED during the pandemic. And this is a perfect example of the first step. Concrete action number 1 is just listen. Begin listening to your teams and consider mapping the journey of your own people in your organization. Now, I don't mean sit down with every clinician, although that would be really, really impressive. But with each department, sit down over a meal and understand what they do, their successes, obstacles, opportunities for development, and seek out that space where those opportunities align with success for your organization and your community. Our program really begins with purpose and recognition. It's critical we understand the motivation of our clinicians, and we then help reconnect them to that purpose. Now, many hospitals start meetings with a clinical case. Think of applying that in a much, much broader context. You know, as an interviewer for the Duke School of Medicine, almost every interview I ever conducted had future students that would say they're going into medicine to help people, right? Myself included, and honestly, this is probably the case for a lot of you. Now, whether you went into medicine to serve your community or to be a positive role model, or as someone with a passion to teach, we need to rediscover and reconnect to that purpose. When we talk about purpose, what we're really talking about is motivation. And if you're interested in the science around motivation, I'd highly recommend checking out Drive by Daniel Pink. In his book, he talks about these fascinating incentive studies done by Sam Glucksberg. Essentially, to illustrate the power of incentives, Glucksberg asked individuals to work on solving this complex problem called the candle problem. And this required some out-of-the-box thinking. Basically, half the group is just given the problem and timed. And the other half is given the problem, timed, but also offered a monetary reward. How much faster do you think the incentivized group performed? It took them on average 3.5 minutes longer. Now, that's not how it's supposed to work, right? I mean, we have an entire society built on free markets and bonuses and incentives. That should drive performance, right? I mean, that's the name of the book. But Glucksberg figures out that incentives actually dull thinking and slow down performance for complicated tasks. So last weekend, as I was preparing for this talk, my wife, who also happens to be a physician, she's a hospitalist, she was working clinically, and I had the responsibility of watching all 3 of our girls. We have 3 girls. We're blessed, 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and 2-year-old going on 20. I figured that the kids' bookshelf needed some rearranging. So I initially just asked them to show me how they would reorganize the shelf. And this became our control group. Now you can see the work they did. They demonstrated mastery. I mean, this was unprompted and really terrific work. I then took all of the books out of the shelf and I asked them to do it again, but this time I offered an incentive, right? It's July, it's 95 million degrees out in North Carolina heat, and I offered to take them to ice cream. Now they were faster, slightly, but they clearly lacked mastery. You can judge the results for yourself. Pink explains contingent motivators. If you do this, then you get that. Work fine for simple problems, but for high-level, complex tasks, they don't work, and they often do harm. This is highly reproducible over 40 years of research, and unfortunately, highly ignored. So where would you place the practice of medicine, right? Imagine you're asked to evaluate a patient with a life or death issue. Now you've got to interpret the vital signs. You take the history. You've got to review the prior medical records in this new EHR. Don't forget, you've got to check the medications for interactions. And then you do your clinical exam, your patient exam. You also have to consider the social determinants of health. Factor in the patient's own understanding of their body. You work through other resource limitations. Then you have to consider some expensive diagnostics like Mike did. And ultimately, after all of that, you think about selecting treatments that balance being effective with a range of side effects. Oh, and make sure you wash all your hands because, COVID. The if-then approach often fails. It fails patients, and it will potentially fail communities and your clinicians. Why is this important? Because how you motivate clinicians directly ties into their performance, their efficiency, their resilience, and their satisfaction, and ultimately yours. You want happy clinicians, and clinicians want to do things because they matter. So Pink lays out this radical new approach built around intrinsic motivation that we're building upon. Basically, the three key elements are, number one, autonomy, the urge to direct our own lives. Number two, mastery, the desire to perfect our craft. And number three, purpose, right? The need to serve something larger than ourselves. So our first step in Personal Sigma recognizes the autonomy of clinicians. It acknowledges the desire to be expert, and it reconnects to the lives of the patients we care for. Patients are not work RVUs. They're an opportunity to serve a greater good. So here's what we did. We asked our medical directors as part of our patient safety organization to roll out an annual review process for every clinician. Now individuals can sit down, review their work over the year, frame up annual goals, and map out deliberate steps to achieve them. Now this may be acquiring a new skill set, it may be learning a new procedure, taking a board exam, it may be mentorship for others in the practice, whatever it is. We've also enhanced our support of professional development and encouraged them to take their clinical passion and translate that into the health system. So it may be peer review. This may be sitting on sepsis or stroke committee. Most importantly, we've taken the reams and reams of clinical data, productivity data, patient experience data, and started to report that at the individual level. Every quarter, we sort through all of the positive patient comments from our practices and report them directly to individual clinicians. The final evolution of this will actually be to publicly recognize them for making an impact on high-risk medical conditions. The Harvard Business Review says that the ideal praise to criticism ratio is nearly 6-to-1. We're committed to listening to our people, helping them map out their journey, and recognizing the good work they do. This is Ms. Cora, also from our EBS team, always ready with a few kind words, and again, reflects concrete action number 2. Get involved in public recognition. Recognize the great saves at your hospital. Round on the inpatients that came through the ED or that were referred in by one of your primary care physicians, and close the loop by thanking the individuals that cared for them. And remember the ratio, 6-to-1. The second element of our program is based around high performance coaching. Now, some say it's a misconception that you can motivate your employees, right? That they're already motivated, and the key is to unleash this motivation. Part of this, though, is realizing that for too many clinicians who've sacrificed and deferred dreams over the years between med school and residency and fellowship, that professional development effectively stops when they start clinical practice. Here is where we started to look at our colleagues differently, more like the way we look at professional athletes. We came to the realization that high-performance training requires high-performance coaching. And as I thought about our 2,000 clinicians spread all over the United States with different time zones and different clinical schedules, inspiration hit in the form of a terrible late-night commercial. Now, many of you probably remember this. It's a snowy Christmas day, happy wife coming down the steps with her daughter, has her eyes covered, and she's looking over to the Christmas tree. And then her reaction when she opens her eyes and sees that the gift is an exercise bike. I mean, this was priceless, right? Actually, I can put a price to it. So this commercial was the Peloton commercial last Christmas. It cost the company over $1 billion after they lost about 10.5% of their market cap in the following 3 days after airing this commercial. I mean, this launched thousands of angry memes. I think I've got a few examples here. And while some people will say, all publicity is good publicity, they took a beating for this. Now, all of that said, did you know that there are 1.4 million subscribers on these bikes every month? So the idea of a scalable, on-demand, online coaching solution is already here. Now, what we needed was a system that was focused on enhancing communication, on building this culture of self-awareness, on teaching stress management. We wanted something that built emotional and situational intelligence. And like many things in life, we needed it to be affordable. So fortunately, my partner, Mike, had already gone through a course with many of these characteristics. So I called Mike. We met up with the leadership at One Team Leadership based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we approached them to create a web-based curriculum for our clinicians in the field. And the result of that is our Live Well to Lead Well campaign. Every other week, we release a custom coaching session developed by One Team for our team members. The webinars come with simple at-home exercises geared towards life stress. And they cover everything from thriving in the chaos of a clinical shift to being present with your family and your inner circle, to being a more effective leader. It's been a phenomenal success. So far, we're averaging a click-through rate of about 50% with our on-demand coaching series. In addition to this, we've also committed to putting several small group cohorts through on-site training. Now, while it's currently on pause due to coronavirus and travel restrictions, we're really excited about this. In the future, we want to focus these groups around several important cohorts: new graduates, medical directors, female partners, and minority partners that promotes dialogue around some of the common challenges they experience. So our concrete step number 3 is centers on education. Commit to hosting a grand rounds or formal wellness talk at your own institution. And listen, if you can't find someone, I'm going to go ahead and volunteer Mike and make him available to come to you, because maybe this is the start of your own wellness coaching practice. The third element of our program really speaks to the need to anticipate common failure points and develop institutional knowledge around wellness. Now, in healthcare, 2 things are absolutely certain. Nearly every one of us that serves is going to experience the loss of a patient. And at some point, we're all going to be patients. So whether it's from an exhaustion from a string of tough clinical shifts, or the loss of a patient, or the loss of a loved one at home, we have to foster a culture where life challenges don't become a slippery slope leading to stigma, moral injury, or disciplinary action, but where they're anticipated, they're planned for, and they're intervened upon early. We intentionally wanted to create a living curriculum on wellness that's widely accessible. So whether you're a new graduate in July, a mid-career doc at the prime of your career, or a veteran nurse practitioner at the twilight of your career, these resources would always be available to you. What's the impact of circadian rhythm on your performance? What's the best way to work overnight? How should you eat during a clinical shift? How do you ensure you're sleeping well? Or when's the best time for that extra hit of coffee? Now, as you're sitting there listening to this riveting talk, imagine you start to get excited and you start having palpitations and you get a little sweaty and you start to get lightheaded and you rush to your hospital and an EKG is performed revealing an abnormal heart rhythm. You're going to need to have a complex procedure called a heart ablation. So the nursing team starts talking to you about this procedure, and they say, you know what, don't worry. Dr. Patel is on today. He's excellent. He's going to take great care of you. He's one of our best. And imagine as a patient, the first face you see is this. How does that make you feel? I mean, as a patient, don't you want to know that your clinician is well-rested, clear-headed, and operating at their best? Here's what we've done. We started to create an entire online library of wellness-related content, of talks, readings, presentations. We're actively gathering this content that's evidence-based but reflects optimal lifestyle modifications, focusing on nutrition, restorative sleep, fitness, and self-care. Our plan is to invite guest speakers like Dyke Drummond on happiness, or Peter Attia on longevity, or Nisha Mehta on advocacy, and others, with a plan to make this content available to all team members. We also see this as a bank where we can direct struggling clinicians for targeted expert advice. Concrete step number 4, and start small here, is again on education. Have managers begin by emailing wellness-related articles. Choose a highly regarded wellness book, and if you don't have one, take one off our shelf. We're happy to share our reading list. Consider making this a regular activity, like a high-performance book club. Now, the last few months have been a testament to the need for people to be heard. While we're going to discuss coronavirus in much more detail later, and likely that's an entire different talk in and of itself, I want to highlight the need at times of stress for people to seek out community. Now, whether this is a church or a social organization or neighbors or a group of friends, as social beings, we look to those around us during times of stress. As most of you know, about 3 weeks ago, July 1st, we got a whole new wave of young clinicians into our practices. I want to share with you some of the advice given to them online. Now, these comments range from welcoming and warm and encouraging to, frankly, shocking and unprofessional. And they were shared in online clinician groups, discussion boards, and review sites. As Mike pointed out, our organizations absolutely need to be part of these communities. You know, our average clinician will spend over a third of their waking hours in your health system. They'll spend that time immersed in the volatility and daily stress of healthcare. So what's our approach here? We decided to establish a peer advocate network. This is a team of regional clinicians with formal training as advocates who can listen, who can model, who can coach and partner and support colleagues. We see wellness champions as having 3 primary objectives. The first is serving as practice guides. They're active clinicians that are available to their colleagues. And the second is that they're hosts of regional wellness events. They support a positive culture and help celebrate wins. And the third, they are an early warning system. So they reach out to that struggling colleague and refer them or guide them into the right counseling resource. Now, organizationally, we're committed to getting these peer champions through formal wellness training, just like what Mike went through. And we want to ensure they're professionally trained and that they also have a support team, each other. Now, it's important to note, building on what I said, a few slides ago about motivation, that these folks are going to be volunteers. Their only incentive is their own intrinsic motivation to help their partners. And believe it or not, we've already got a wait list. The concrete step number 5, mentorship. Commit today to becoming a mentor for clinical leaders in your own organizations. I know many of you have already taken this step. Choose 3. Why 3? A few may not work out, but invest in mentorship, and that's an investment that will be passed on from generation to generation of organizational leaders. Now, over the last 35 years, we've learned a lot of lessons. And early on, we saw the need as an independent practice to deliver high quality, but allow standardization and sharing of best practice. Over the years, we've developed efficient operations and smart scheduling and performance-based compensation. We also allow everyone, physicians, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and company employees to own in the company. Our ownership model means that everyone on the team is rowing in the same direction. They all have a vested interest in long-term success. It's frankly led to some of our proudest innovations as a company, but I realize that this model isn't available to everyone. You don't have to change your model, but you do sometimes need to change your focus. We already talked about supporting individual clinicians, and personally, we've increased our communication to our people dramatically over the last year to reflect that. We also took two other important initiatives that I want to share with you. The first is the development of our patient safety organization. Like peer review, this is a part of our team solely focused on improving medical quality and safety in a protected environment. It creates this safe space to report adverse events and near misses. It promotes transparency without judgment. It's a place to provide education, analysis, feedback. Frankly, it's just a place where we can learn from each other. The second is our development of a comprehensive telehealth offering. Now, with many of our colleagues at risk on front lines for quarantine or exposure to COVID, we accelerated our plans to deploy this. We saw the need to safely bring clinicians together with patients. And so with our partner, RelyMD, based out of Raleigh, we created workflows around virtual community care, COVID telehealth screening. We've also started doing virtual consults with disadvantaged populations, like the homeless and in prisons. And we're now exploring things like remote patient monitoring. Both of these programs came from a true desire to support our clinical teams. And frankly, they just made great business sense. Now, as a Duke fan, I can't do a presentation without the obligatory Coach K quote. And talking about teams, here it is. When you first assemble a group, it's not a team right off the bat. It's only a collection of individuals. What Coach is saying is teams take real work. So concrete step number 6, build your team. Gain trust. Talk about what keeps you up at night as a leader. And think about setting milestones related to departmental performance that create a shared resource win for clinical teams. Lastly, ask some clinical leaders to be part of an innovation council where you can vet technologies that would benefit your institution and your community. The final piece to our program is the safety net, the 24/7 availability of an independent counseling service for self-reported or challenges identified by peers. And after looking at several providers in this space, we finally found one with deep experience supporting clinicians. And it's critical to have the right partner here because of the confidential chain and the state and national reporting concerns. This service is free to our clinicians and will cover everything from anxiety and depression to parenting concerns to dealing with addictive behaviors and loss. And we all have stories of team members that have struggled and ultimately lost battles to this. I'm glad to see this being talked about more openly in society. Many of you may have followed the popular podcast by Wondery, Dr. Death. I think it's been downloaded by over 50 million people. The Dr. Death story talks about notorious neurosurgeon Dr. Dunch. And I'm not going to ruin the story. It's really amazing and well done. But it's a fascinating case that highlights the failure of a fragmented healthcare system. It's now actually a must listen for our credentialing, licensing, and recruiting departments. Our internal teams listen to this podcast to reinforce the importance of the work they do. I also asked our teams to identify ways in which we could elevate the industry standard in the work that we're doing to ensure that patient safety is always our highest priority. Now, in preparing for this talk, I also thought about the fact that this podcast really highlights the way that our system can sometimes fail clinicians that are at risk or in need. From first meeting someone to interviewing to setting expectations to onboarding to supporting their practice, we need to have a system that identifies the need for help, intervenes early, and is fully accountable. And I'm incredibly grateful to our team members that carry these duties out with the highest precision. This podcast should reinforce to us what's really at stake. And my hope is that the stories of these patients create a change in the system, and our goal is to help lead that change. So concrete action number 7, and this is perhaps the easiest, just listen to the podcast, share it with your teams, and think about how your own support processes can be more clinician-centric. Again, foster a culture that encourages outreach and reduces stigma. In summary, we've discussed the various elements of our program. I've shared some of the concrete actions that you can take to make an immediate impact. And our vision remains to help clinicians reach their highest and best potential to serve your communities. I'm going to end with this picture from the website of the University of Kentucky's graduate program in high performance coaching. It's really kind of well done and cool. It describes the role that a high-performance coach has, right, to collaborate with professionals, to collect additional physiological and wellness data and player load data and integrate that into enhancing performance. Our goal with Personal Sigma is exactly this. So let's work together to unleash the potential that your clinicians possess. And with that, I'm going to ask Evan Howell, our Chief Clinical Operations Officer, to talk about the way we applied Personal Sigma throughout this pandemic. Evan?
Thanks, Yogan. As Yogan said, we created the Personal Sigma program to change the game on performance, wellness, and resilience for our physicians and advanced practice clinicians, or APCs. Never have we been more in need of that change than with the arrival of COVID-19 in the U.S. and the crises that followed. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to discuss how we adapted our Personal Sigma program to address the early and ongoing challenges of the pandemic. For most of our frontline clinicians, the COVID crisis presented some of the greatest challenges they had faced in their careers. So we utilized the purpose and recognition principle in our program to help reinforce their resolve in caring for their patients and communities while they coped with the unparalleled difficulties in both their professional and personal lives. As you all know, communication is paramount in high uncertainty situations. So at the outset of the pandemic in March, we implemented a daily medical director and lead APC call, as well as a daily operations team call. These calls enabled our local leadership and executive leadership teams to engage in up-to-the-minute discussions on all the challenges our frontline teams are facing and provide a safe platform for peer support. Additionally, myself and several other key executive leaders, including our CEO, COO, president, and regional president, carried out Zoom conferences with all our APC teams across the country. These face-to-face Zoom conferences allow for real-time Q&A, live support, individual recognition, and most importantly, full transparency. Even though the information we were conveying was frequently difficult to discuss and often fluid due to the numerous unforeseen impacts of the pandemic, our APC's responses to these conferences were overwhelmingly positive. Finally, we believed it was vital to show our physicians and APCs the impact that they were making in their patients' lives and communities. So we developed a quarterly report, like the one you see on the slide, that highlights the hours they were putting in on the front lines, the number of lives they were touching, and the positive feedback the patients and their family members had submitted about their care. Unprecedented events have seemingly been an endless supply since the onset of COVID-19. But there has been a silver lining. All the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic provided our organization the unique opportunity to engage in the living curriculum of wellness that Yogan discussed. A novel virus is new territory for everyone, and failure is certain as we struggle to learn how to best treat patients and support our doctors and APCs. So it became imperative for our executive leadership and frontline clinicians to quickly embrace and apply Carol Dweck's description of a growth mindset. A perfect example of this was the initial push to move quickly to intubation in order to stabilize a more serious COVID patient's breathing. As the pandemic has progressed, we've learned that ventilating patients frequently causes more lung damage for survivors, and it has not improved overall mortality. Based on what we learned from the failure of this early approach, the current recommendation is to try to avoid intubation and ventilation for as long as medically possible. And we made sure our clinician leaders were informed of this change the day the recommendation was released. But failure is never an easy thing to accept as a learning tool, and it's especially difficult to embrace when delivering healthcare. So in order to foster this growth mindset and support our clinicians, Yogan sends out a weekly COVID-19 newsletter that covers everything from the most up-to-date research and trials on diagnosis and treatment to the personal and societal impacts of this disease. Another lesson we learned early in the pandemic is just how critical the role of high-performance coaching and peer advocacy was going to be for our frontline clinicians. Our web-based Live Well to Lead Well program that Yogan discussed continues to provide coaching on performance and wellness, but we broaden the scope of these principles to more effectively address the crisis at hand. With COVID-19, we don't know what we don't know. So we immediately began seeking the expertise we were lacking. This included securing guest speakers on our daily calls from the early hot zones overseas and in the U.S. They not only provided invaluable guidance on how to best treat and care for COVID patients, but also on how our clinicians could best take care of themselves, both physically and mentally. And as more of our partner facilities begin seeing an increase in COVID volume, we established a new network of peer advocacy and mentorship by connecting our clinicians further into the pandemic with those who were just starting to see their numbers rise. Finally, we created a COVID-19 resource page on our organization's platform that highlights key information from all our guest speaker discussions and provides links to resources covering everything from diagnosis and treatment best practices to wellness recommendations. Pioneering innovative ways to support our practices has not only been an essential element of our Personal Sigma program, but also on our ability to adapt and respond to the COVID-19 crisis. When the pandemic began to unfold, it became evident that personal protective equipment supplies across the country were going to be strained. As we quickly worked to procure the PPE our clinicians needed, our operations teams utilized their intimate knowledge of each practice to assess the level of predicted shortages, and this enabled us to distribute PPE to all of our clinicians in need. Additionally, we were able to apply our clinical operations team's extensive experience with split flow throughput models to assist our partner facilities with creating safer environments to initiate care on both COVID or PUI patients and the non-COVID emergencies that were still arriving. Finally, we established new relationships with hospitals in hot zone areas to help ensure our clinicians who were volunteering for deployment would be going into as safe an environment as possible. Over the last 5 months, we've all seen the news or read the reports detailing the life-altering negative toll COVID-19 has taken on the mental well-being of our frontline healthcare providers. From COVID-related PTSD and depression to the overwhelming frustration and grief our clinicians are enduring, we knew the counseling principle in our Personal Sigma program would be more essential now than ever before. As Mike discussed at the beginning of our presentation, if we don't address and treat the harmful effects these conditions have on clinicians, they will rapidly begin to impact their families as well. Because of this, we're working to build a network of therapists who not only provide confidential individual counseling, but also have experience with and knowledge of the unique challenges our physicians and APCs are currently facing. We've learned a tremendous amount and witnessed some truly amazing results throughout our Personal Sigma journey. We hope our experience has provided some concrete steps and tangible takeaways which you can apply. Although our program was initially developed to support our physicians and APCs, the principles of this program can be applied to all areas of an organization. So now take the word clinician out of everything we just said and replace it with tech, nurse, first responder, environmental services, administrator. There are lessons for every team member. Healthcare is a team sport, and we rise and fall together. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll now open it up to any questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Lipscomb, Dr. Patel, and Evan for such a fantastic presentation. We'll now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboards, and we will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. Looks like a lot of great questions are already rolling in. The first is from an audience member who asks, what are the different kinds of stress, and what are the real roots of stress, and how can that be addressed?
This is Mike. Boy, I love that question. I'm going to hop in and answer that. Great question. Exactly right. We need to understand what causes stress in our team members. And I'll tell you, it is different for different team members. And that is the importance of what Yogan talked about in step number 1 is we need to go ask the clinicians at the ground level what's frustrating them. As an emergency physician, I can answer. Boy, stress can come from a number of angles. It can come from, say, high volumes. There's busy days and slow days, and we all know that there's optimal staffing. But on those busy days, and when that happens over and over and over for days in a row, that definitely adds to stress. Second one would be like difficult high acuity patients, like we're seeing right now with COVID. Is even though we may be seeing the same number of patients, we're just seeing patients just sick, and there's just nothing you can do about it. We're admitting another one, and I could be getting this myself. And the last one I think is just like frustration at work. The EMR, there's peer review, there's lack of nurses, there's lack of PE. How can I get my job done? So you have to ask the doctors at the ground level and APCs, what's going on. Then you help them remove the roadblocks. And I can't tell you, show them that you care. I cannot tell you how important it is to me when I am, working and it's busy, and the CEO walks through our ER and he says, How can I help you today? What's going on down here? I cannot underscore how important that is to be a visible presence on the ground in front of your clinicians. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. If Yogan or Evan want to chime in, go ahead.
Sorry, guys, I was just coming off mute. Yeah, Mike, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at the APA or et cetera, there's lots of ways to classify stress. I mean, they will talk about acute and episodic versus chronic stress, and not all stress is bad, right? Some stress does push us to perform at a higher level at times. But I think given just the last year that we've had and the last 6 months with COVID and quarantine, social distancing, the situation with school reopenings, I mean, clinicians and healthcare workers across the board are wrestling with very, very difficult situations. And to Mike's point, until you actually sit down and talk to people, you don't know whether they're caring for elderly parents. They have a special needs child at home. Do they have the ability to access childcare or not? I'll give you a quick example. Last week, one of our practices mentioned that their lead radiology tech had a death in the family due to coronavirus. Now, you know, that not only impacts that person and that family, but that takes that person out of commission. That person happened to be the linchpin for the entire radiology department. So that entire team is affected. And ultimately, that potentially impacts patient care. So this is a situation where, as a system, is it possible to have redundancy? Is it possible to have other clinical leaders from other pieces of the organization that can step in to help fill that gap? These are all things that need to be talked about. And I know that every person on this call is sitting in the middle of this stress right now. So it's tough to carve out time to speak to this. But we'd love to help you. And so if we can, please reach out to us, and we'd love to be able to be part of that conversation for your organization.
Perfect. Appreciate you both sharing your insights there. So thank you. Looks like we have time for about one more question. This audience member is saying, this seems like a lot. If I were to choose just one program to focus on, what would you recommend as the most impactful?
I would say, just to get the answer started, I think being a leader that is listening, as Mike said, and being visible in the department is critical. With all the things that are happening right now, people need to feel that connection to leadership. And I think rounding regularly, a lot of our systems do leadership rounding, taking that to the next level, that is critical to success. I think the other pieces that we have developed, and we're happy to talk more about those offline with people, objectively, we're able to measure the impact of the click-through rate on the on-demand coaching series. I think making sure that your people have access to an EAP program or wellness and counseling resources. People are going to be affected for the next 6 months and longer in a variety of ways. And I think helping to create support structures in your own organization, whether it's for parenting concerns or grief counseling or relationship concerns with the increased stress, those things are going to be important. And I believe that, unfortunately, we're going to have tough roads ahead, but together we'll be able to get through it. So that'd be my initial answer, I guess.
Yeah. So one concrete step we did, and we realized that I strongly believe in this communication. And during this COVID crisis, when physicians and ATCs were losing hours and we had to cut rates a little bit and so on, was just that communication, explaining to them why it's going to happen, explaining you're not going to lose your job. We are going to keep you in place. And when this whole thing gets better, things will return. And just that constant communication. I can't tell you how much positive feedback we've received from the clinicians on the ground who were scared for how they were going to take care of their family and so on. Just that reassurance we gave them on just a regular daily basis. So important. Communication, and being visible.
I'll kind of chime in on that too. I know we only have a minute left, but from my standpoint on the clinical operations side, it was definitely the purpose and recognition. So, and that, we all see the heroes work here signs everywhere, but really trying to find an example of a true heroic act or something that was valuable to the team or the organization, something specific that you can identify and recognize your team members for. As Jürgen alluded to, there's all kinds of motivation, but time and time again, it's always shown that recognition and support for your providers publicly goes a tremendously long way, and especially in these tough times, it makes a huge difference, not only to recognize them, but have very specific examples of how they're serving their communities and their patients.
Absolutely. I think all wise words to end on. So Dr. Lipscomb, Dr. Patel, Evans, thank you again so much for such a great presentation, and thank you to Apollo MD for sponsoring today's webinar. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.